Betty, hello, and I first, on behalf of Mary and myself, want to thank you so much for allowing us to come to your home here in Sag Harbor and talk with you. It's an honor, and it's our privilege, and I just want to thank you for agreeing to do it. There is so much to talk about, so many questions to ask in a very short time. So we're just going to plunge in and make the obvious comment that we're sitting and talking with a woman who made an enormous mark on the 20th century, on this country, on the entire direction and face of the 20th century. The project that we're doing is a documentary that is really going to be speaking to the 21st century, representing for us a real opportunity for you to speak into the 21st century and to imagine, let's say 20, 30, 40 years from now, someone looks at this tape and listens to and sees Betty Friedan. In your voice, in your image, what do you want to say to someone in the middle of the 21st century? What's the message?
Well, I hope by then our focus will no longer have to be women as such or women vis-a-vis men. It will be on to, if we will have achieved what at this moment we seem to be achieving, real equality of women and men. Recent statistics, women were making something like 74 cents on the dollar to what men were making in the U.S. But when you analyze the figures, the discrepancy, it was equity in the beginning, equity at the mid-level, discrepancy beginning with the childbearing years. And the U.S. was a backward country then, still is, but hopefully not by the time you air this. For instance, we don't have paid parental leave. We don't have paid parental leave. We don't have a national child care program. We should have one beginning at 6 months. Most women can't take more than leave from that, and most mothers of children in America are working outside the home. We haven't caught up to the reality in our institutions yet. But when I read those statistics recently that women were making 74 cents on the dollar from men, but equity at the mid-level and the beginning level, I thought, okay, if men were trained to, brought up to, and assume equal responsibility for the care of the children, we could pull up our skirts, declare victory, and move on. But there is no move in that regard yet.
How do you describe that? We have new generations of young women. They have higher aspirations than our generation did by far. I know this. I teach them. They're still saying, I'm not a feminist. But,
yeah.
However, when you ask them what they want to do, oh, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a doctor, all this stuff, it's in their heads.
I'm going to sit on the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Right.
But getting from here to there, why is it we seem to be stuck on that?
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, I don't buy, I don't know that we're stuck, and I certainly don't think we're in any period of reaction. You could say we're in a sort of, not just on feminist issues, not just on women, we're in the political and cultural doldrums in America at this stage. You know what I mean? Nothing is really happening. Nobody is fired up. So I know that from my earliest adult consciousness, I had my personal life, my family, my career, but I also was always a part of the movement. And that's what I think is missing in the young people today. And maybe it's like there's no movement for them to be part of. Now, if you were in a minority, and you had the problem, the movement having to do with racism, and if you were a woman, you had the women's movement. But now that, in a certain technical way, a literal way, we've achieved equality, where is the next movement? Where is the movement? Where is the cutting edge?
Do you think that it will take something negative, an attack that looks serious on abortion rights, for example, to wake people up? Or do you think ultimately 2 and 2 will be put together? You've been saying for more than 25 years, we don't need to take back the night, we need to take back the day. We need to take back work and work opportunities. But it doesn't seem to be galvanizing this notion. Women are moving into these work opportunities, but they still have the double day.
They still have
the double day of going back home and assuming the lion's share of all the work there.
No, shall we say this, there's no movement that women are now making 50% or more of the income in 50% or more of American families. Are men sharing 50% of the housework? Are they expected to share 50% of the housework and the child care? Do you see any movement in that regard?
Do you think that that has to be the goal?
Well, I'm not sure. But I think there should be something in that direction, and I don't see it. And I don't know who's going to lead it. It doesn't feel right that a movement that will require men, say, assuming 50% of the child care, of the responsibility for the children, can that be pushed or imposed by women? Or do some men have to move toward that? At this point, as we talk here, I don't see any movement to that end.
Betty, how do you explain that? In other words, given the fact there was a movement that you launched, the women's movement, given the fact that there's been enormous change in occupational patterns, in education patterns, in roles, given the fact that this issue has not been a secret, it's been out there from the beginning, how do you explain the fact that that change doesn't seem to be taking place? I look at young women, I look at my daughter's age, I look at my students. I don't see that change happening. How do you explain it?
Well, now wait a minute. Let's not be unaware of change that's happening. Certainly, men are expected to, and assume that they will, take much more responsibility for the children in the home than they used to. I mean, I see it with my sons. I see it, with the young people that I know, and I sense it in the culture generally. You don't, the man with the baby in the backpack is not a freakish sight on the streets of our cities today, large or small. Now, whether 50% of the responsibility or anything, I wouldn't go that far, but certainly there has been a large change in what is expected of men vis-a-vis the children and the home, and what men assume, accept the responsibility.
Betty, when you look back at the last 40 years, what has been the biggest change, in your opinion?
Well, I would probably have to say consciousness, the change in consciousness. It used to be, what do you want to be, little boy, when you grow up? Butcher, baker, candlestick maker, whatever. Oh, you're a pretty little girl. You'll be a mommy like mommy. Now, what do you want to be, little girl, when you grow up? I mean, that's the biggest change, isn't it? That women are expected to, brought up to, and expect themselves to take part in society on their own, not just as wives and mothers, and are doing it. And are doing it.
Yes, and those counter messages are more subtle now, I think. That, oh, but I also have to be the primary child care giver, and so forth. But
Well,
you're absolutely right. Huge changes happen.
The mother bit, you know, the overemphasis on mother in American society. Not good. Not good. That way we're worse than Europe, you know.
How do you mean?
What? Well, it's that, I don't know how we got that way, really, but the idea that somehow the mother is the one completely responsible of the welfare of the children and the family. Why the mother? No.
Let me approach this from another angle, education. I think of you and your background. You came from the heartland, but you went out east to school. And you went to Smith College, the best college for women, as you say in your biography. What about now? Is part of the answer here trying to find ways to encourage young men through education? I hear my students saying, my boyfriend asks me after my women's studies class what happened, but he would never in the world sign up for a women's studies class.
Oh, I don't know. Where was I teaching? University of Southern California. And the department, one of the things that attracted me was studies of women and men. Studies of women and men.
And men did sign up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that's the next step somehow, that men have to be more conscious of the change that they in fact are already living.
Well, I think we have to find a way to make it more comfortable for young men to enter these classes that are dealing with issues of gender and work and family. And so far, I don't think they feel comfortable in those spaces.
Well, they have to be, whoever makes the curriculum or whatever, they don't have, I mean, it shouldn't be that these are women's studies and then, well, we'll bring in a few token men. Of course they're not comfortable. They have to be study of women and men. You know, study of gender roles, whatever you want to call it. But it shouldn't be just women anymore.
I want to ask you a question about the kinds of controversial things that you say, just like this. But you know, that you have been saying for 25 or 30 years. You've been saying we've got to bring men into the picture. And at various points in the movement, this was an unwelcome message. And I want to ask you a bit about the pain that you had to deal with when people confronted you and said, and you kept giving the same message. And I find this so admirable. But at the same time, you were right. Well, that's good. You confirmed that you're right. And I think you were right. But at the same time, it wasn't easy. And I guess one of the things I'm asking you is, how did you find the courage over and over and over to say the same messages without asking yourself, well, maybe I'm not right?
I don't know if you could call it courage, but you know, I was right, and I knew I was right, and I have I've often referred to this sort of my inner Geiger counter, you know, my gut, you know, and it's not been wrong, you know, and you know, sooner or later it becomes clearer that the women's movement was not wrong. And the idea that the woman's enemy is not man, you know, I mean, that's not a wrong idea. And so, you know, the further we go along and the more we actually act to change the situation, to change the condition, to change the oppression, whatever it is, the more confidence we get, and then the more we see our way clear, you know, redefine the problem.
Well, that's the issue that I'd like to pursue with young women, because one of the things that I see that they are lacking is the kind of courage that you seem to have had from a very young person, certainly from college, to speak up and make your voice heard. I think that one of the things that's very difficult for young women who are even self-identified feminists now is to be consistent and strong when they run into conflict and to express their own views. And what's your message to them about how you managed it, in addition to being absolutely sure you're right? Because I'm not sure a lot of these young women think so. But I think they need somehow to find the courage to do what you did, or whatever it was.
When I started, shall we say, to come of age, this is in the 1950s,
Okay.
the early 60s, the 1950s, when women were supposed to speak in a whispery voice. You know, that Jackie Kennedy was the idol, and the motto, and she had this whispery voice. One of the first things I did when I was able to really speak to her was say, you have to speak loud enough to be heard.
You know, I want to go back to something you said a minute ago when you said you were not wrong, you were right, and in explaining that, you said, and you have said consistently, men are not the enemy, men are not the problem for what we call women's oppression. What is it?
Well, I don't think that there's not a single thing. But, you know, women were the handmaiden of everything. You know, women were...
But who decided
They did the housework. They did the housework at home. They did the housework of industry. And the work they did was so underrated that it was never well paid. And so women had not only to get into the well-paying decision-making profession and roles, but then they also had to get respect for and pay for the housework of industry that still had to be done.
But Betty, where's the responsibility for that? In other words, can we say there's a problem, whether it has a name or it doesn't have a name, and not point to something, someone's, and say, well, that's where the responsibility is for the problem and for the change?
I don't know that there's a single finger, you know, of blame. I think that that's the way society was rigged. The men obviously had advantage from that. And for a long while, women just took what advantage they could from their relationship to men. Wife, whatever. The movement for equality is not that old. The movement for women's equality. And, you know, if you think about that, I think about it, it was in the air, equality, freedom, civil rights movement. And from way back, the women came home from the anti-slavery conference in London. They were the ministers' wives. The ministers had gone to the anti-slavery conference. And they came home, and in Seneca Falls, they had a meeting, and they said, hey, wait a minute, you know, what about us? And, you know,
1840 and 1848.
You know, we're not that much better off, you know, than these slaves, and so on and so forth. But it never got very far without being turned off, pushed back. You hold on, You know, we got to free the slaves first, we got to do this first, we got to do that first. And so then finally, there was no more holding back, and we had the women's movement.
So your answer would be you really have to look at history. And to see, you have to look at history.
Yep.
And see what was changing and how at a certain point the women looked around and said, it's our turn. It ought to have been our turn long before. I think there's a lot to what you're saying about shifts going on that finally consciousness is born.
For instance, as more and more women got educated in the United States, a very high proportion of women getting higher education in the United States. Now, in Europe, when women were educated, they served in professions. But in America, until relatively recently, you had the educated housewife. And she did leadership work in the community. She had the League of Women Voters and all that. All sorts of innovations that were important for the development and the evolution of American communities began sort of outside of the professional world, you know, in education and the like. And women's community leadership, civic leadership was very important. It's only the last 20, 30 years that women are expected to and do, you know, use their education for professional development and practice.
And that's making all the difference.
Well, it's making a lot of difference, but before that, there was this civic leadership, this community leadership that was very important.
Yeah.
I know I read somewhere that many of the important innovations in education came outside of the profession as a result of women's activity.
Your book, Feminine Mystique, galvanized for so many people. You wrote the book about it. It changed my life. This kind of sense that all of this is happening and we're being left out, and you were able to focus in. What I would like to know is, when you look back on it, you've said in print, I didn't know I was creating the revolution when I wrote this, but that's in effect what happened. I guess, maybe we can talk about the Geiger counter or whatever it is, but the gift that you had to articulate and then also to focus on who has to read this. I know that, what's his name, David Horowitz, wrote about your life as a freelance writer and working in the labor union movement and all the rest. And he didn't know quite what to make of that, because he thought you'd abandoned all of this rather than making a conscious choice, which is what I think you did, about who your audience was at that point. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I never abandoned any part of my life or background, and I give certainly credit not only to my formal education, which was brilliant at Smith and all, Berkeley and all that, but to my education, for instance, the labor movement. In writing, you know, I was a reporter. There was a news agency called Federated Press that served labor unions. And then I worked for an outfit called Trade Union Service, which published, among other things, the UE, United Electrical Workers, the UE News. So I got the job because when they asked me questions, I was pretty ignorant of it. They asked me what was the difference between the AFL-CIO and the CIO. And I didn't know too much about it, but I said, well, I know one is more conservative, but I don't remember. So they said, they figured I was ignorant enough that I couldn't be a communist, so therefore, and I got great on-the-job training, you know, because I, you know, go out in the middle of the night and take the subway and cover strikes and God knows what, and I learned on the job, as it were, a lot. But now, what was your question?
Well, I was interested in your selection of the audience for the Feminine Mystique because there was so much criticism after the fact. Well, my goodness, you know, this is addressed to middle-class women, and isn't she aware there's a wider world? And then Horowitz's book came out and said, of course she's aware of a wider world. And I've never seen your comment about why this particular group, but it seemed to be so obvious. They were the ones who were going to be the most responsive and moved to do something about it. But
I was addressing myself, I guess, to the educated housewife. I mean, women had, by now, quite a lot of education in the United States. I think that average 2 years of college, you know, they had not yet averaged 4 years of college, but that meant if it was average 2 years of college, quite a lot had finished college. They'd all finished high school, you know, and they were not expected to be using their abilities in professions. Relatively few went on to professions. Now, of course, I think that's quite different. But, you know what I wrote about, the problem that has no name. Well, there were these bright, well-educated, able women. And, you know, what were they supposed to do with it? You know, what were they supposed to do with themselves?
Betty, in addition to, you answered before, you thought the biggest change was probably, if you had to say one thing, you'd say consciousness. And obviously, the Feminine Mystique has something to do with triggering consciousness and teaching consciousness. But that's a book, and consciousness is a state of mind. And then what happened was a movement happened. And you didn't just write a book and publish a book and watch consciousness change. You then jumped into organizing and developing a movement.
Right.
I want you to talk a little bit about that. First of all, when did you know that you weren't a reporter, a journalist, a publisher of a book, and suddenly you're in the middle of organizing the National Organization for Women, the National Women's Political Caucus, the National Abortion Rights Action League, the now Legal Defense and Education Fund,
well,
a movement.
Even in the end of the Feminine Mystique, somewhere, you know, in my writing, I knew that what I was saying, you know, that in the Feminine Mystique implied enormous social change and institutions, and that there would have to be a movement of social change. And you might say that I took responsibility, decided I had to help take responsibility for the movement that I helped bring into being, you know. But anyway, that aspect of my being began much earlier. I know I've told this story before, but let's see, I was the editor of the Smith paper, so I was like 20. And this was the day of Eleanor Roosevelt and the student movement, American, yeah, right. So I was a snobbish little Smith girl, but I figured that I should go to Washington and cover this March on Washington that Mrs. Roosevelt had helped call for. I took the train and felt very brave and daring and also uncomfortable. And then I was there in Washington on the sidewalk, and I watched all these kids marching, and then somebody called up the troops, you know, the horse. The
National Guard?
National Guard, right. So the National Guard starts moving on these kids. I was furious. I got down off the curb and joined the march, and I've not stopped marching.
That's what got it going. Anger. Do you, when you think back on all of that, honestly, from this vantage point, far further into the future, do you think that someone can be a writer, a thinker, an organizer, activist, do all of that? Or do you think those things can go together easily? I'm saying that because I know there were controversies around the movement part of it, at least.
Well, I don't know. I did it. But,
talk about what you enjoyed most about all of this. We can get later to what you enjoyed least, but do you enjoy the business of writing more? Did you enjoy the involvement in creating a movement more?
Oh.
Where do you identify?
Well, look. Let's face it. Writing is hard work. You know that.
Oh, terrible.
So you enjoy having written, but I don't know that you necessarily enjoy the writing.
Mm-hmm.
Something you have to do. But the building the movement and all of that is very
Exciting.
exciting, very much fun.
When you look back, is there any particular moment that you think of that you would have liked to have go differently, that you wish you would have made a different decision? Or at this point, do you not think about?
I don't really. It's all been, it's all happened so fast, and it's been so rich, and it's been basically satisfying. I could ask myself, and I don't really take much time to do that, but I think that the women's movement got off on a tangent of the sexual politics and too much focus on sexual issues, abortion, take back the night, that kind of crap. Should I have spoken out more strongly against that sort of thing?
Well, you did speak out against it at the time.
I did, and I did try to keep an eye on the economic stuff, which I always thought was basic. And I still think so. And I still think that to some degree, we let ourselves be diverted by the sexual issues. And it was a cheap diversion. I mean, abortion, it's important that women have the right to abortion. But that didn't threaten anybody as much as, well, it threatened the Catholic Church and so on, but movement for higher wages, for women's work and all the rest of that. I don't think I was wrong, and I still think I'm wrong, that economics, the basis is the base.
And the rest, you think we got off, or women, or the women's movement got off
Diversion,
and has not come back?
Well,
or
no, that is not come.
branched into streams? Or?
We have dealt with economic, and we are dealing with economic. But the sexual issues were, and to some degree still are, a cheap diversion. They don't really threaten anybody. Well, they threaten the Catholic Church, maybe, whatever, but...
Well, let's talk about the Catholic Church, or about fundamentalism generally. To what extent do you see the organized right, whether it's through religion or through political movements, as responsible for slowing down the progress of a gender revolution or a human revolution?
I don't know. I don't see it. I don't see it slowing down.
You don't really
I think it's happened very fast. I think that
the Pat Robertsons, the Jerry Falwells
take for granted the things that seemed revolutionary when I was younger. That I think that the far-right reaction is marginal.
Do you have the same optimistic view that a lot of us are trying to have about the rise of fundamentalism in other parts of the globe?
Now that's another matter. I don't. It's not. It's worrisome. It's worrisome. See, you know, the more complex the problems of society are, the more there is a sort of feeding ground for fundamentalist epidemic. You know, sort of a need for easy answers, and then there are powerful reactionary forces that I think love to see women diverted to preoccupation with the sexual issues.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I know in your recent autobiography, at several points you mention concern that the CIA or the FBI may have been involved in fomenting difficulties within the movement, both domestic and in the international
I don't know whether
conference.
the CIA or whoever it was,
Yeah.
but I know that, what do you call that where you get the records, the Freedom of
Information Act, yes.
Well, there was infiltration of the women's movement, as there was of the student movement and the civil rights movement, labor movement. There was infiltration of the women's movement. We know that. My hunch is that there was infiltration that promoted extremism. See, I mean that, you know, the women's movement had the potential of being and has been a very broad-based, powerful movement. Well, all you needed to do was to divert it to extreme, you know, anti-man, anti-motherhood, and so you lose it. And so, I mean, the extremist voices, while they might have purported to be radical, were, to me, suspicious, because they played it into the hands of reaction.
You were saying that we were talking about the CIA and the FBI and the Freedom of Information Act. Have you ever looked at your file?
You know what? I can't remember. I think either I did or somebody did, and it was all newspaper clips. You know, it was nothing, and then
really
everything else was classified, because if it was revealed or made open, it would incriminate agents in place. So you had to conclude from that something was going on, you know, that they were not ignoring the women's movement. But that's about as far as I got.
So the idea being that there were agents in place, presumably assigned to cover you.
Yeah.
I see.
So at different times, we sometimes speculated on who they might be, and if somebody continued to live very well with no visible source of income, you know. And I'm not going to name any names because I have no proof, but
we all talk about the women's movement, certainly the part that the Feminine Mystique was involved with in the beginning, the NOW and the Women's Political Caucus. These are all American phenomena, an American movement for women's equality, women's liberation. But now we only talk about feminism and the women's movement in a global context because, in fact, the ideas and the issues and the questions and the activities are worldwide. Some of that generated by the United Nations conferences. And I know you were involved with them, and in particular, I wonder if you'd describe, just so we have it for that 21st century record, your memory of what led you to sit under that tree in Nairobi. Because that image is such a wonderful image of the wise woman. Could you describe that?
Well, I'm just trying to remember how that happened.
It was 1995, right?
85.
I'm sorry, 85.
This woman from Finland who was the organizing the conference. Can't think of her name.
I can't do it.
Maybe from Iceland, Vigdis Finnegabotar.
No, that wasn't.
No.
Anyway, I went to see her. God, she was very, very good, very able. I can't think of her. Anyway, and
You're not thinking of Gro Harlem Brundtland? Are you thinking of Gro Harlem Brundtland from Norway? No? Okay.
She wasn't.
Anyway,
What is this?
it was going to be very big, very important, this International Women's Conference. And we wanted it to be able to accomplish something, and we didn't want it to be have energy siphoned off in extremism, so-called radical, but never really is radical. It always plays into the hands of reaction. And so we dreamed up this idea. We really couldn't predict or control what was happening every day. We dreamed up this idea that I would sit under a tree in the middle of somewhere at a certain time every day, and people that wanted to talk to me would gather around, and we would somehow use that, keep our finger on the pulse, as it were, and be sure that it kept eye on the ball, and not get steered off into a lot of extremist directions. And as I recall, it worked pretty well.
Got a lot of international press.
What?
Lots of international press coverage, your picture and attention.
Right.
And did you get large audiences from all over the world?
Well, it was a very big conference. And certainly I sort of remember, I got a lot of women and pretty broadly represented.
Well, I think it was so brilliant. The accounts that I read of it suggested that because of the way you conducted it, a number of women were able to talk about things they hadn't talked about at all in their villages. And by the end of the week, they had decided they needed to do something about them.
And as I remember looking out from my hotel window or something like that, and I saw women in chador, marching. And they had their banners in Arabic or whatever. I didn't know what they were marching for, probably something I didn't agree with at all. But I was so happy to see them marching, because once they start marching, they're not going to go back home.
I can tell that you're a big believer in marching. You
Oh,
say
yeah.
that's what happened to you in Washington? That's what you saw of the women in the world. The march as a fundamental tool of movements.
Yeah, right.
One of the things that's so interesting to me when we ask you questions about, who is responsible for all of this, you don't want to lay a whole lot of blame at men's feet. You don't want to lay a whole lot of blame at the feet of the fundamentalists who have been trying to slow women down.
Well, because I think they're marginal.
Right. Well, let's talk about the more central ones. You may or may not choose to bring some blame, but I've noticed lately that when you talk about concerns about structures in the world, you're talking about corporate structures a lot. And you're concerned that how much more can women change? Isn't it time for the structures in the wider world to change? Now, how much of this do you see as, first of all, changeable, and who's going to do the changing?
Yeah, that's the question. Well, I think that fundamental restructuring is implied. And who's going to do it? At the moment, I don't see it. In other words, the labor movement is trying to get more money for everybody. There is no women's movement. There's no youth movement. There's not really a civil rights movement anymore. No. And you need something larger now. And it isn't going to be doesn't seem to me, women alone. Or women vis-a-vis men. I think it's next step somewhere.
Does, in all your thinking about change, social change, is movement an antiquated concept? Do we have to think about some other way that change?
I don't know the answer to that. In other words, is there some post-20th century way of change that doesn't necessarily require or imply a mass movement or any movement? It doesn't, to me, that doesn't seem feasible somehow, but
it's almost like a science fiction question, right? To
yes,
imagine.
exactly.
It is, and it boggles.
Well,
the
you know,
mind.
sometimes if I get depressed or this or that, or I think things are just not changing, or the doldrums, not reaction. We're not in a period of reaction. Doldrums. Or I ask some colleague or, you know, even so-called expert, whatever. When will we get another period of social change? And the answer I invariably get is not until another economic downturn. Now, I don't know that I buy that, because the women's movement did not come out of an economic downturn. It did not come out of it. It certainly had to challenge the economics of things. And certainly that was always my message. I never thought the sexual issues were defining. I thought the economic. But it did not come out of an economic downturn.
You say that the imperative is, if I'm quoting you correctly, that economic policies should support social objectives. That for you is the central imperative. The issue, the question we're discussing is, how do you get economic policies to do that? And if it doesn't take a movement,
well, it takes
it's not
something.
some corporate CEO waking up and saying,
no.
I'm going to do it.
A lot of the people who look at governments these days are saying that, at least in a traditional sense, they're becoming obsolete. Governments need to reinvent themselves for a global era in which they can be, in some sense, more watchdogs on a larger paradigm shift, in your term, to maintain a more equal standard of living, for example, to narrow this gap between the wealthiest and the poorest, all these kinds of things. What role do you see government playing in this vision that you're describing?
I don't know. See, if I were younger, I would see myself as leading or helping to lead a resistance to American domination. I mean, there's too much not only is the wage discrepancy in America getting worse and worse, but the discrepancy between the power and the wealth of the U.S. and the rest of the world is getting worse and worse. And sooner or later, there's going to be a massive resistance, the third world or whatever,
to American dominance and to that formulation of greed is the way that I think you've described it often. That American domination is fueled by greed, I think, as a value is what you've...
Corporate greed.
Yeah, by corporate greed. At the top of, you talk about change in corporations and in corporate life and in work life that you see as important, flex time, shorter work week, that kind of thing. And there, women and men would have an equal shot, perhaps, in a better world at more flexible time, shorter work weeks. But someone's still going to be running the corporations. Someone's still going to be at the top of leadership in corporations, in government, in education. Do you see women as wanting those roles?
I don't know. Certainly women are ambitious, and they do want a piece of the action, and they want to get into command positions. I never know how to answer. If women ran it, would we blah blah blah? You know, like if women ran it, would we get into a
Well,
war?
I think you have said it eloquently, profoundly, and simply, and I had to write this down. You said, if the human race is to survive, we must find ways to prevent women from being disadvantaged if they choose to have children. I think bottom line is this: the hierarchy that emerges not only in this country but around the world, and you put your finger right on it. I don't know what the solutions are either, but I think you're a beacon in setting out what are the issues that we have to address.
Well, you know, the implication is that either women have children, or they have careers, or they seek command. It's still too much either or, isn't it? And like, for instance, I might have said this or in a different way before, but I read the statistics. So women now, 74 cents on the dollar that they're making compared to men in the U.S. But the discrepancy begins in the child-bearing, child-rearing years. It's never caught up. Now, so women are earning the same number of advanced degrees now as men in the U.S. If men were expected to take equal responsibility for the children, you know, we really would be very far on the road to equality, but there is no movement to that effect, is there?
So does this become the message to the 21st century to wake up and generate that movement?
I can't, it's not in me to say that. You know, it seems to me that I cannot see that women can organize that among men. I mean, that men have to organize it. So I have no crystal ball that tells me how it's going to happen or who's going to make it happen. But I think that is what's called for.
So the message to the 21st century is, you know what's called for, and the challenge is figure out how to do it.
Well, find the men or convince them or bring them up to do it.